What if I told you that there was a gospel so powerful, so controversial, that it was completely erased from history? A text that didn't simply recount the story of faith, but uncovered buried teachings, radical miracles, and another world's war against oppression. One so perilous, the powerful made certain it would be erased from memory. It was no usual scripture, the Acts of Andrew. It was a text that chronicled the life, miracles, and final days of one of Jesus's most intimate disciples, though, today, it is a shattered mystery. Why was this gospel banned? What secrets did it hold? And why does its erasure still matter today? Standing in the ancient city of Patras, Greece, for example, it is somewhere around 60 AD. And the Roman Empire is at the height of its power. The streets bustle with merchants, soldiers, and stirring of rebellion. Among the many, one man, humble but stalwart, steps in the front. His name is Andrew, and he is Peter's brother, and he comes bearing a message that will rattle the empire. But not on this message here. At a remove, the Roman governor observes, inscrutable, as Andrew describes a kingdom not built by imperial men, but by belief. Andrew had no idea that came of his remarks would be a blood-curdling execution. But his legacy, the stories of his miracles, his tussles with Roman authorities, and his ultimate act of defiance, would survive in an illegal manuscript, the Acts of Andrew. This gospel lived in secrecy for centuries, whispered in the ears of believers, transcribed in chambers of concealment, then condemned by the powers that attempted to dominate history. But why? What did it reveal that was so menacing? To grasp this, we need first to discover who Andrew was and why his story was deemed a threat. In the history of Christianity, Peter, Paul, and John are the prevailing names. But what about Andrew? Most know him only as the brother of Peter, but his role in the first days of the church was anything but trifling. He was also one of the first disciples of Jesus. Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist before he was called to Christ, according to John's Gospel. He was the one who brought Peter to Jesus, saying, "We have found the Messiah," John 1:41. This makes Andrew the first ever missionary in Christian history. While Peter became a pivotal person in the life of Rome, Andrew went on to bring the gospel to places most would never think to go: Scythia, Achaia, and even as far as present-day Russia. Early writings about Christians suggest that he preached in places rich with pagan ritual, confronting spiritual darkness as few apostles ever did. But Andrew's biggest test was in Patras, Greece, where he faced the power of Rome itself. His message of faith, humility, and defiance of imperial rule was regarded as a direct threat to the Roman authorities. And it was here that Andrew came to a deadly end. But his story didn't die with him. His followers filmed every step of his travels in a gospel called the Acts of Andrew, a writing that would later be criticized as heretical. The Acts of Andrew, unlike the four canonical Gospels, is not merely a retelling of a life of Jesus. Rather, it is an epic, near-cinematic narrative of Andrew's final mission, an epic filled with miraculous encounters, dramatic confrontations, and then death, which was supposed to silence him, but instead turned him into a legend. The Acts of Andrew depicts Andrew as explicitly opposing Rome's power by depicting him as a radical religious soldier instead of a preacher. Andrew is described as performing incredible miracles, healing the sick, raising the dead, and even fighting against evil spirits. Per this text, Andrew's execution was much more than a punishment. It was a statement. Nick joined Jesus' disciples only to be crucified on an X-shaped cross, unwilling to deny his faith even as he suffered. And so it is likely that for the Roman authorities, this gospel was dangerous propaganda, the previous passage underlining the possible basis for resisting oppression under imperial rule. If ordinary citizens thought that an apostle had taken on the Roman Empire and actually worked miracles, that could topple the structures of power. Thus, the gospel was silenced, condemned, and finally erased from Christian history. The Roman Empire was different by the 4th century. Christianity, a formerly persecuted faith, had become the state religion of the Roman Empire by Emperor Constantine. But with this new power came a burden. The church started to control what was acceptable literature and what was too dangerous to be canonized in the Bible. The church formally condemned the Acts of Andrew as apocryphal. Survivors of them were either burned or just left to rot in secret. This once powerful gospel survived only in scattered fragments, buried in monasteries or hidden in obscure texts of antiquity. But why does this matter today? Because history is written by whoever wields the narrative. The existence and later erasure of this gospel tells us that the early story of Christianity was more complicated than we have been led to believe. The Acts of Andrew offers an image of faith that challenged empire, resisted oppression, and welcomed divine wonders in ways that established Christianity later sought to minimize. What else has been lost? What other secrets remain buried in dusty texts? In this day and age of information being borrowed, rewritten, and sometimes erased, the story of the Acts of Andrew becomes increasingly applicable. It dares us to wonder, what truths have been hidden from us? It reminds us that those in power are the ones who write the history, and that sometimes what's not included is more important than what is included. It encourages us to reconsider our perceptions of primitive Christianity and the position of such figures as Andrew. That's what lost scriptures can still tell us. These are fragments of a puzzle that was never supposed to fit together. However, now we have an opportunity to shine light on these events through his eyes, in a way that we never could before on our own. So if you're interested in this biblical hidden mystery, and you want to know more about the lost Gospels, don't forget to subscribe now, Bible says. And here's a way you can help these lost texts be discovered. Send a super thanks to support our quest at uncovering the mysteries of the ancient world. Never forget, because history must never be forgotten. Saint Andrew is one of the least known but arguably most important of Jesus' disciples. He wasn't just another disciple. He was one of the first to identify Jesus as the Messiah. By the time of Jesus Christ, Andrew was already searching for truth and waiting for the Messiah. The Gospel of John recognizes Andrew as a disciple of John the Baptist. Andrew's response was immediate when John pointed toward Jesus and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." John 1:36. He was so eager to know who Jesus is, he followed immediately. That small but critical choice would alter Andrew's life permanently. Peter instead became the rock foundation of the church and moved into the spotlight when it came to his role in the New Testament, whereas Andrew worked both silently and simultaneously with him. Thus, his name is not emphasized as much. He was the one who first brought Peter to Jesus, saying, "We have found the Messiah." John 1:41. He was the first missionary in all of Christian history, the first person to bring someone to Christ. But Andrew's story wasn't one of glory or recognition despite this honor. It was filled with difficulty, rejection, and steadfast faith. Andrew's troubles started almost right away. Following Jesus was a course of action that would necessitate everything: his home and family and the safety of his fishing trade. Andrew was a fisherman by trade and lived in the town of Bethsaida by the Sea of Galilee, just like Peter, James, and John. Fishing was more than just a job. It was a way of life, passed down from generation to generation. To walk away from it was to walk toward the unknown. But for Andrew, Following Jesus was the only kind of security he cared about. Andrew is portrayed throughout the Gospels as a man of quiet faith and action. In one of the Bible's most well-known miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, the one who noticed a young boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish was Andrew, John 6:8-9. Well, others will doubt, how so little can feed so many? But Andrew still brought the boy to Jesus, assuring that something miraculous can happen. This tiny detail speaks volumes about Andrew's character. He didn't need to understand everything. He only needed to believe. But trust didn't mean his journey was free of fear or struggle. Andrew, one of the intimate 12 disciples of Jesus, saw not just miraculous healings and divine teachings, he witnessed the growing opposition of religious leaders against the Lamb of God. The disciples must confuse these statements and see the tension rising in Jerusalem, the anger toward Jesus growing, and the disheartening truth that their mission would not lead to victory but to suffering. He probably experienced the same fear that seized the other disciples when Jesus spoke of his forthcoming death. The man he had given up everything to follow was headed towards crucifixion, and Andrew couldn't stop it. When Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, Andrew fled like most of the disciples. This was the same man who had trailblazed behind Jesus without questioning it before. Now he stared down the impending dread of torture. This moment of weakness, though, did not destroy his faith. This all changed after Jesus' resurrection, when Andrew was one of the people who saw the risen Christ. His doubts, fears, and limits as a human no longer mattered. He had witnessed the final truth that Jesus had triumphed over death. Andrew was instrumental in starting the early church after the ascension of Jesus. However, his work often flew under the radar of more recognized apostles like Peter and Paul. Some of the best traditions say that Andrew traveled far past guides of the gospel being preached, making new disciples beyond Jerusalem. Some speculate that he traveled only as far as Scythia, the region of modern-day Ukraine and Russia. Others say he preached in Asia Minor and Greece. He brought the message of Jesus wherever he went, often against hostility, rejection, and imprisonment. Andrew's steadfast faith ultimately cost him his life as a martyr. He was arrested in the city of Patras, Greece, for preaching Christianity and sentenced to death by crucifixion. But Andrew, unlike Jesus, was not nailed to a regular cross. He wasn't, however, nailed to an X-shaped cross, which is known nowadays as the St. Andrew's Cross. Andrew did not plead for mercy or renounce his faith even in his last moments. Instead, he looked on his crucifixion as a chance to glorify God. Some accounts suggest that he preached to those who passed by as he hung there for 2 days before dying, not letting his agony silence him. Andrew's story is of understated faithfulness. He was not a bold leader like Peter or a theological mind like Paul. He did not pen epistles that formed Christian doctrine, nor did he engage in dramatic public acts of insubordination to Rome, but he followed, he trusted, and he never quit spreading the message of Jesus. He also reminds us that it takes faith not only to be on display, it is sometimes about small, faithful increments, even when the world doesn't see. The Acts of Andrew is but one of many ancient Christian writings lost to the mists of time, intentionally excised from history, or simply forgotten. While the canonical Gospels offer a narrative framework for the life and teaching of Jesus, the Acts of Andrew fall within a different genre of writing in early Christianity: apocryphal Acts. These texts frequently dealt with the adventures, miracles, and martyrdom of the apostles and offered a window into how Christianity spread out from Jerusalem into the wider world. So what was it that set the Acts of Andrew apart, and why was it ultimately turned down by the early church? It is very difficult to trace the origins of this lost gospel with certainty. It was probably written sometime in the 2nd century AD, a few decades after the New Testament texts were finished, scholars say. Unbeknownst to the writers were the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all anonymous but traditionally attributed to their namesakes. This was likely written by an unknown Christian scribe. Date depicted uncertain, but some early traditions attribute it to Lucius Carinus, an ambiguous person related with other non-canonical actions. But without direct evidence, this is conjectural. What we do know is that the Acts of Andrew was once widely read among Christians, especially in the east of the Roman Empire. The text was probably written in Greek, and it took a narrative form like those of other apocryphal acts, telling the story of Andrew not simply as a disciple, but as a heroic figure who travels to many countries, performs miracles, preaches against idolatry, and converts peasants and kings alike to Christianity. In contrast to the canonical Acts of the Apostles, which documents the missionary journeys of Peter and Paul, this lost gospel emphasized Andrew's travels and included descriptions of his interactions with pagans, his struggles with Roman authorities, as well as his martyrdom. The theological and philosophical themes of the Acts of Andrew are among its most compelling features. Its teachings focused on austere religious practice, a life removed of all worldly contentment. More of the remaining fragments portray Andrew urging people, especially married couples, to give up their physical intimacy and devote themselves completely to spiritual purity. Its radical eschewal of sex and renunciation of the world differentiated it from orthodox Christian doctrine, allowing it to have special influence in some early strains of Christian sectism. The Acts of Andrew also included a mystical side that caused some of the early church leaders concern. It cast Andrew as a miracle worker whose powers extended beyond old-school biblical passages. Others claim he was able to govern nature, converse with angels, and even dictate the outcome of souls in the afterlife. Such Gnosticizing elements, in combination with its focus on asceticism, would have dovetailed closely with Gnostic thought, a theological movement that was gaining traction in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. One of Gnosticism's main tenets was that salvation came through hidden knowledge, gnosis, and that the material world was itself tainted. Though not explicitly Gnostic in nature, the content of the Acts of Andrew attracted the ire of mainstream Christian authorities simply by playing into themes that Gnostic communities would also come to embrace. The Acts of Andrew was popular early on, but faced more and more opposition from church leaders. By the 4th century, as Christian doctrine became increasingly standardized, texts that deviated from the emerging orthodoxy were examined and frequently condemned. Some, like Eusebius of Caesarea, considered the Acts of Andrew unreliable and heretical. The book was never included in the canon of Scripture, and subsequently, efforts were made to keep it from circulating. When the biblical canon was officially formed, the Acts of Andrew had long been forgotten, doomed to survive only in broken pieces and the odd quotation in later works. It is worth noting that the Acts of Andrew, like many similar texts, were not rejected simply because their teachings fell outside orthodoxy. It was also part of a larger campaign to define the limits of Christian belief. 4. The early church worked to unify its preaching, to include only true texts, those that were in continuity with the tradition and doctrine of the apostles. Texts such as the Acts of Andrew, which had things in their content that would have contested or complicated these teachings, were then left in the dust. Only small remnants of this gospel of the lost remain, now reduced to scraps, with the tantalizing mystery of a very different early Christianity blotted out of history. The Acts of Andrew are teachings so radical, they go right to the foundation of what would become the early Orthodox Christian Church, making it a danger both to the religious authorities and the Roman Empire. In stark contrast to the canonical Gospels, which permeated the infant Christian community with faith in Jesus, the worship of his community, and moral rules for everyday life. The Acts of Andrew offered ideas which undermined social structures, redefined human relationships, and introduced an extreme asceticism into the lives of early Christians. While some early sects embraced these ideas, within the increasingly established church, they were viewed as perils that might fracture faith and undermine church authority. So the church fought to impose a unity of thought and a version of events that befit it. Nowhere in this pre-New Testament world, it seems, was asceticism more pronounced than in the Acts of Andrew, which glorified a total rejection of worldly ties, such as family, possessions, and even marriage. Andrew is portrayed as an insatiable proponent of celibacy, regularly convincing married couples to part and give their lives completely over to God. He trumpets that physical intimacy, even when it happens in wedlock, is an impediment to the spiritual journey, and being truly devoted to God means severing all earthly attachments. This teaching was anathema even in early Christian communities, where marriage was widely regarded as a sacred and God-ordained institution. Yes, to be sure, Christianity themselves promote trust and abstinence, but the radical anti-family stance found in the writing of the Acts of Andrew was far beyond Christian normativity, if indeed Christian normativity can be divined. This radical asceticism closely aligned with the teachings of the Encratites, a sect that regarded all physical pleasures, including food, drink, and marriage, as impediments to spiritual enlightenment. These notions were dangerous to the church because not only did they discourage procreation, leading to fewer followers to grow Christian communities, they also looked too much inwardly at personal sacrifice and away from collective faith. The canonical Gospels, on the other hand, depicted Jesus attending weddings, dining with sinners, and interacting with society in a way that implied balance rather than complete aversion to the material world. Andrew's teachings, however, suggested that salvation was only reserved for those who renounced all worldly pleasures, which didn't mesh with the church's long-term agenda. The Acts of Andrew similarly advanced an alternative conception of divine wisdom that privileged mystical experience over institutionalized religion. Andrew is portrayed not merely as an apostle who spreads the teachings of Christ, but as a spiritual master who has secret knowledge. He works miracles that appear to go against the laws of nature, controlling the elements, speaking to angels, and ordering spirits. He hints at an esoteric truth that only the really faithful can comprehend, a belief structure that closely mirrors the doctrines of Gnostic sects. Gnostic Christianity undermined the church's authority and challenged their core beliefs, leading the early church to view it as a serious threat to their mission and the status quo of the time. The Acts of Andrew reflected similar mystical themes, presenting Andrew as a mediator who could lead his readers to transgression of the orthodox boundaries of belief. That notion of secret knowledge worried church leaders who were trying to create a single set of beliefs all adherents could follow. If knowledge of the divine was personal and experiential, not something handed down through the apostles and church leaders, then even the concept of religious authority itself was rendered suspect. The early church demanded structure, hierarchy, and control in order to survive, and any text that compelled believers to go outside of the established doctrine for their own paths to enlightenment was viewed as a direct assault on that order. Probably the most politically dangerous part of the Acts of Andrew was its vigorous hostility to worldly rulers and Roman authorities. Andrew, throughout the text, openly challenges Rome, rebels against their orders, and urges everyone to renounce submission to men and embrace God's authority, Acts 5:29. This was, in the context of the Roman Empire, a dangerous message, for they were fine with Christianity unless it called for insurrection or undermined imperial dominion. The insistence in the text that true Christians must eschew earthly governance in favor of the authority of God placed it at odds with both the Roman government and the increasingly organized Christian church, which was working to keep things peaceful with political leaders. Andrew's defiance wasn't just a matter of religious conviction, it was an invitation to rebel against all human authority. He called on extension of hundreds of billions of dollars from the Federal Reserve to keep banks from collapsing, request $600 billion to save American capitalism, and believe you will be persecuted, tortured, die for your belief. This was an exceptionally dangerous text at a time when Christianity was still fighting for legitimacy. Church leaders wanted to disabuse themselves of any teachings that might excite the ire of the Roman state, and the Acts of Andrew was full of material that could be construed as subversive or revolutionary. Furthermore, Andrew's representation in this text did not quite meet the parameters set by the church regarding the definition of the apostles' role. While Peter is regarded as the rock on which the church was built, and Paul as the apostle who spread the faith throughout the Roman world, Andrew's character in this text takes on an almost supernatural dimension. Not just a preacher, but a mystic, a miracle worker, a being who somehow existed beyond the limits of man. His behavior was typically much closer to that of a wandering ascetic sage than of a conventional apostle, which made him a man of many faces and, at times, a disquieting presence for those attempting to impose some legitimacy and hierarchy on the burgeoning faith. By the time the church formalized the biblical canon, the so-called Acts of Andrew were deemed too extreme, too mystical, and too dangerous to be included. While fighting external threats to Rome, the church was also compelled to respond to internal divisions and schisms between sects of Christianity, each claiming to know the true meaning of Christ's message. And to give them a stable and unified faith, some teachings had to be suppressed, and texts that wandered too far from the agreed-upon doctrine had to be erased. The Acts of Andrew was one of those casualties. Despite the popularity of restitutionism among certain Christian groups, it was gradually condemned as heretical and banned, and eventually lost to history. Now only a few scattered references and fragments survive, hinting at a form of Christianity much more mystic, radical, and defiant than the one that ultimately triumphed. It isn't just that these texts were preserved, it's who got to preserve them. It's a war over authority. Who got to be an authority? Who got to be part of the canon? Who got to produce theology? What was blessed? What was not? What is Christianity? What will it be? Title: Was there a Gnostic gospel? In the first centuries of the faith, many texts were in circulation among Christians, claiming to offer divine wisdom. Others, such as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, had widespread acceptance in the early church, while other texts, such as the Acts of Andrew, faced resistance. It was not only a matter of what texts were inspired, it mattered whether they fit in the forming structure of the church. The banning of particular books was not merely the rejection of false teaching, but the effort to consolidate power and define orthodoxy. The Acts of Andrew was one of many writings to find itself on the losing end of such a struggle. Popular with various early Christian sects, especially those with ascetic or mystical doctrines, its ultimate authority was increasingly viewed by church authorities as a threat. The exclusion of such texts started long before the official formation of the canon. While the earliest Christian communities practiced everything based on oral tradition and apostles' letters, divergent sects emerged with differing teachings, and church leaders sensed the need of having one collection of scriptures that should be standard for everyone. That resulted in centuries of arguing, choosing, and in many cases suppressing completely. It is the association of the Acts of Andrew with various non-Orthodox Christian currents, such as Gnostic and Encretite sects, that helped make its rejection one of the major reasons for the rejection of the Acts of Andrew. Their beliefs differed so sharply from the church's bishops, reshaping the faith. One sect, the Ankratites, preached radical asceticism and claimed that whether through marriage or procreation, the act itself was a sin that distracted the person from the goal of attaining a state of spiritual purity. Andrew acted as a champion of celibacy, denial of bodily pleasure, and total disinterest in material existence, similar to the Acts of Andrew. This ran counter to the church's increasing focus on marriage as a holy institution and a prerequisite for Christian society. Formal rejection of texts, such as the Acts of Andrew, took place in a succession of councils of the church, which aimed to establish which writings were divinely inspired and which were considered heretical. However, there was never any single moment in time at which the canon was officially closed, but certain councils played a pivotal role in the same, such as the Synod of Laodicea, circa 363 AD, the Council of Hippo, 393 AD, and the Council of Carthage, 397 AD. These councils instituted the requirement that only certain texts could be read in churches and used for purposes of theological instruction. The Acts of Andrew were excluded, in large part, because of their radical asceticism, mystical elements, and subversive themes. The church's choice to suppress certain books was not just theological, it was political as well. By the year 300, the Christian movement had transformed from an outlaw religion to the established religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Constantine. This shift meant that Christian doctrine stopped being merely something to have faith in. It now also served as a tool to preserve social order and imperial stability. The version of Christianity the Roman authorities, and the bishops who collaborated with them, required was one that promoted obedience, unity, and institutional power. Texts that promoted personal spiritual enlightenment over ecclesiastical authority, or that called upon defiance of worldly rulers, were considered frightening. Andrew wrote so much potentially subversive material into the Acts of Andrew. Matthew characterizes Andrew not merely a proclaimer of Christ's word, but a radical agent of social change. He openly challenged Roman authorities, convinced believers to abandon any allegiance to human power in favor of divine law, and preached a view of Christianity in which spiritual knowledge trumped compliance with ecclesiastical authority. Such teachings ran counter to the church's drive to establish a stable and hierarchical religious system. Another huge factor in its suppression was that Andrew was depicted as magical, doing wonders and mysteries, and sharing confidential knowledge. Whereas the canonical Gospels were devoted to life, death, and resurrection, the Acts of Andrew focused on visions, miracles, and secret knowledge. This put it in line with Gnostic writings, which argued that salvation was achieved through enlightenment rather than faith alone. Gnostic notions were an especially big deal for early church leaders who worried that such doctrines threatened Christian comprehension with fracturing. The church thereby wanted to become an entity that guaranteed a doctrine that was clear, structured, and available to all believers, and not a phenomenon that depended on mystical experiences or secret revelations of which only some were prospected. The suppression of texts, such as the Acts of Andrew, did not stop with church councils. Such works by real giants were all actively condemned, destroyed, or allowed to languish in obscurity over time. Bishops and theologians wrote in opposition to them, warning followers of the faith to steer clear of such texts. The church fathers, propped up by Irenaeus up to Tertullian all the way to Epiphanius, were inundated with so-called alternative scriptures and labeled them heretical. It was during this time, as the church's teachings solidified and acquired political authority, that most, if not all, of these forbidden books perished, existing only in memes or references by critics. The Acts of Andrew and other such texts did not die out completely, however, despite the Church's best efforts. They spread among smaller Christian sects, monks and scholars who preserved copies in hidden collections. Despite not being considered canonical, parts of these texts were subsequently found in early manuscripts, shedding light on the variety and sometimes contradictory views found in pre-Nicene Christianity. The fight to decide which books should be part of the faith was not an abstract decision, but a power struggle over who could control the faith itself. St. Andrew's martyrdom story is one that is filled with unwavering faith, defying worldly powers, and ultimate sacrifice. Andrew, one of Jesus' closest disciples, traveled great distances to preach the message of Christ, but eventually his witness would also lead him to persecution and death like many other early Christians. The story of his martyrdom, as told in the Acts of Andrew, is not only a tale of physical suffering, but also a narrative of faith's power, the struggle between heavenly truth and worldly authority, and the indomitable spirit of those who decided to follow Christ, even in the face of peril. Based on tradition and history, Andrew preached not only in Judea, but also in Scythia, Thrace, Achaia, and other places, confirming the faith of many. However, his success made him a target for Roman authorities and local rulers, who perceived Christianity as a growing threat to their political and religious order. As it happened, Andrew's teaching got him into direct conflict with the Roman proconsul Aegeates in the city of Patras, in what is now Greece. The governor, a staunch follower of Roman traditions and pagan worship, was incensed by Andrew's power, particularly with a populace that had started to reject Roman deities for the new Christian faith. Aegeates' wife converted to Andrew's faith, and she would no longer worship the Roman gods, which sealed Andrew's fate. This act of insubordination enraged the proconsul, who considered it not only an affront to the empire's religious customs, but also a personal affront. When Andrew was arrested, the Roman authorities ordered him to renounce his faith and to sacrifice to the gods of Rome. But Andrew refused to comply and stood firm, boldly declaring that the one God is the Lord, and he would never forsake Christ. His defiance was punished with a gruesome sentence, crucifixion. Andrew, unlike Jesus, was not himself to be nailed to the cross, but to be tied with ropes. It was chosen on purpose to extend his suffering, to make sure that he will spend days dying from pain before the death comes. He fully embraced his fate, and the Acts of Andrew go so far as to give a poignant and theatrical account of his martyrdom, foregrounding not just the physical suffering, which of course was immense, as the Romans had perfected the art of death via torture, but also the ecstatic spiritual climax of his martyrdom. As Andrew was being bound to the cross, the text says, he did not cry out in desperation, but rather praised God, viewing his crucifixion as a way to grow ever closer to Christ. Perhaps the most notable aspect of the Acts of Andrew is the way it depicts his death as a martyrdom, sure, but also as a triumph of faith. According to this account, even as Andrew hung on the cross, he persistently preached to those who watched. Many will believe in the words of Christ through his words, which unleash the power of God. The message from the hundreds of adjectives in the scripture did not differentiate between evolving or a hearer of the word. Witnesses were said to have been profoundly moved by his courage and saw in him an image of Jesus himself. This moment, the text says, was not simply one of suffering, it was one of triumph over fear, death, and the stifling forces of the Roman Empire. As Andrew languished on the cross for days and the people of Patras watched him with faith, they began to protest against his execution. A surging crowd demanded his release, transfixed by his endurance and the raw strength of his faith. Even elite Roman officials began to waver, some recommending that the proconsul reconsider his sentence. Aegeates, however, stood unmoved. There is a dramatic moment in the Acts of Andrew in which Andrew, aware that his time is at hand, prays to God to not take him down from the cross, but to receive him into the heavenly kingdom. His wish was granted, and legend has it, a brilliant light enveloped him, and his soul ascended before the soldiers attacking him could finish their work. In early Christian thought, Andrew's crucifixion is very important symbolism. According to the Acts of Andrew, he was crucified on X-shaped cross, which is now known the St. Andrew's cross. Its unique form of crucifixion, not the traditional T-shaped cross, would later become one of the most long-lasting emblems that we associate with him. He was not punished, however. Instead, he was a martyr, an embodiment of the principle that following Christ often necessitated great sacrifice. The martyrdom of St. Andrew was significant in shaping the early Christian faith, serving to empower many a believer to face their own fates head-on, regardless of what imminent tragedies may await them. His story became married to oral tradition, written texts, and artwork, a narrative that showed that faith was worth dying for. Andrew's sacrifice became symbolic of the ultimate devotion to Christ, during a time when Christians had been hunted, jailed, and executed for their beliefs. Andrew was executed as part of a much wider wave of Christian martyrdom under the Roman Empire. Rulers such as Nero, Domitian, and Diocletian viewed the growing faith of Christianity as a serious revolt against Rome's authority, and they responded with widespread crackdowns against believers. However, rather than extinguishing the faith, Andrew's martyrdom and that of others fortified it. Their endurance and divine conviction were soon known and attracted, rather than repelled, people from Christianity. Andrew's influence only increased after his death. His relics were revered by early Christians, and his name was commemorated in churches around the world. Patras, where he was crucified, became a major center of Christian pilgrimage. Later, according to tradition, Emperor Constantine translated his relics to Constantinople, solidifying his inclusion in Christian history. His influence transcended the early church, with nations such as Scotland adopting him as their protector, and his cross serving as an enduring symbol in heraldry and religious iconography. St. Andrew's martyrdom goes beyond the tragic end of a faithful life to being a crucial moment in Christian history that embodies the early followers of Christ's courage, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion. His narrative, which has been preserved in writings such as the Acts of Andrew, must serve to remind us of the challenges faced by those who tried to spread the teachings of Jesus, and the remarkable lengths they were prepared to go to defend their faith. The disappearance of the Acts of Andrew was not a straightforward case of a novel lost to the ages. It was a product of a complex struggle between religious authorities, political forces, and the shifting doctrine of the early church. Central to this struggle was the Roman Empire's control over Christian teachings, and the Church's attempts to create a uniform doctrine that had no place for texts that challenged its authority. It was not just a disciple's gospel recounting his deeds. The Acts of Andrew was a book filled with radical ideas that freshly threatened the Roman establishment and the upcoming Orthodox Church created by Paul. The Church was still in the early centuries of Christianity, creating acceptable doctrine and identifying heresy. The Acts of Andrew belonged to a larger group of writings that shared similar narratives about the lives and adventures of the apostles, known as the Apocryphal Acts, including the Acts of Peter, whose legend's character was compared to the Acts of Andrew, Acts of Thomas, Acts of John. Many of these texts contained elements that church leaders did not seek to promote. Many stressed asceticism, supernatural visions, and a nearly mystical kind of Christian devotion that subsequent authorities in the church deemed orthodoxy. The veneration of the bodily vessel as a form of radical asceticism was, perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the core tenets of the Acts of Andrew that led to its erasure from mainstream Christianity. The account depicted Andrew as an ascetic who spurned earthly pleasures, including marriage and material wealth. His disciples could only move toward divine wisdom if they renounced all of the mundanity about them, including worldly attachments, according to his teachings recorded in the book. The extent to which the institutional church needed not only to defend and promote the ideals of asceticism, but also to ensure that their application remained appropriate and could be extended to the demands of governing a vast, growing religious movement, made the extreme focus on asceticism become problematic. After the Roman Empire converts to Christianity under Emperor Constantine, it will become a major arbiter of which texts will be considered authoritative and which ones dangerous. Data. By September 2023. You know what I mean. The Acts of Andrew did not, with the Christianity that the Roman authorities hoped for the world, by the time of the Emperor Theodosius I, who made Christianity the empire's official religion in the late 4th century, texts diverging from the accepted canon were aggressively suppressed. The church councils of this time period were busy trying to establish orthodox doctrine, and books with alternative teachings, such as the Acts of Andrew, were excluded from the biblical canon and accused of heresy. The Acts of Andrew was preserved in a much shorter and modified version through the misidentified writings of a 6th century bishop and historian, Gregory of Tours. His adaptation excised much of the more controversial material, offering a more orthodox view of Andrew's story. This was not an uncommon practice. Many early Christian texts had been edited and rewritten in ways that made them more palatable to the mainstream theology. In this way, Gregory ensured that some part of Andrew's story lived on, even as the original text was perverted. The choice to delete the Acts of Andrew was not just about theology, it was about power. They were consolidating their power, and having one controlling scripture with which to punish heretics was critical to that effort. It may be worse still if multiple versions of apostolic stories were to circulate freely, as it could lead to confusion, division, and the undermining of the authority of leaders in the church. Data is trained until August 2023. Church councils and theologians also worked to eliminate dangerous writings, and the suppression of apocryphal books continued. In the 5th century, Pope Gelasius, A.D. 385 to 398, published a decree that listed out the books which were to be rejected, and the Acts of Andrew was on that list. This wasn't simply an effort to define orthodoxy. It was an effort to define the narrative of Christian history. Books that stressed personal encounters with the divine, extreme ascetic practices, or teachings that varied from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were perceived as menacing to the cohesive nature of the church. Although the church sought to suppress the Acts of Andrew, remnants of its influence persisted. Several of its motifs and concepts married themselves to Christian traditions, especially in monastic movements that practiced asceticism. The tale of Andrew's martyrdom, shaped to accommodate orthodox teachings, inspired believers for centuries. The Acts of Andrew, however, only survives in fragments, and some summaries like the one Gregory of Tours gives, it is clear that the text from which Gregory of Tours is summarizing is rendering the apostles as passive. The book's erasure is a reminder of how history is frequently written by the victors. The reason for the exclusion of the Acts of Andrew was not a spiritual one so much as a logistical one. It simply did not adhere to the narrative of faith that the Church Fathers wanted to put together. The dispute over sacred texts was not purely a theological controversy. It was a contest over the essential identity of Christianity itself. The surviving books served as the basis for Christian belief. Dangerous texts were suppressed, burnt, or forgotten. The Acts of Andrew were excommunicated from the official church history, but never disappeared. This ancient document has not survived in its entirety. Fragments of it are preserved in various writings, including short excerpts and historical references. These fragments give us an insight into what was once a mighty and powerful story about one of Jesus's closest disciples. But the text's very absence has only deepened its allure, and so scholars have labored over the years to recreate it as best they can, teal wood tables groaning with surviving snippets while they compare their findings to other comparable apocryphal texts, in an effort to imagine what once was supposed to be a key text in the early Christian canon. One of the most prominent parts of the Acts of Andrew that survives comes from Gregory of Tours, a 6th century bishop who bestowed a shorter and more orthodox version of the text. Gregory's own version omitted numerous the more controversial details of Andrew's teachings, specifically those that emphasized extreme asceticism and mystical experiences. This version is helpful to understand how the lost gospel might have looked, but I can see that, as is true with this entire series, there was a lot of alteration to conform to what was doctrine in the church at the time. It is likely that the original Acts of Andrew wrote about teachings that significantly deviated from Orthodox Christianity, hence the heavy revision or rejection altogether. Outside of Gregory of Tours' work, researchers have found tiny pieces of the original Acts of Andrew in different ancient manuscripts. Included are mentions in early Christian literature where certain church fathers either referenced the book or spoke of it in the context of heretical material. Fragmentary portions of these texts survive in Coptic, Greek, and Latin, but are often damaged. These excerpts, though short, show a kind of Christianity that focused on individual spiritual insight and disdain for worldly goods and a closeness to God's wisdom. The Acts of Andrew and other so-called forbidden books have long fascinated modern biblical scholars. Now, in the last several decades, a resurgence of interest in lost and suppressed texts, especially in the biblical canon that never received official status and were so erased from the historical record. Recent discoveries of texts, including that Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, and other apocryphal writings, have added fuel to speculation about what early Christianity may have looked like before church authorities formalized its beliefs. The Acts of Andrew has been studied alongside these texts to provide insight into how different Christian communities interpreted and witnessed to the teachings of Jesus and his disciples. Finding these ancient works hasn't been easy. Many of these apocryphic texts, like the Acts of Andrew, were deliberately destroyed or left to decay, in stark contrast to the well-preserved books of the New Testament. Just as some Gnostic books came to light when they were discovered hidden away in the desert town of Nag Hammadi in the mid-20th century, other copies may have been cherished and hidden by their communities. But a full version never turned up, and some scholars think the original form may be lost forever. Even so, the fragments that remain have been sufficient for scholars to piece together some of its themes, characters, and messages. The historical analysis of banned books has also played an important role in modern biblicism. Understanding these lost texts, many researchers argue, can provide a fuller picture of early Christianity. The New Testament tells a unified and ordered story of Jesus' life and teachings, while the apocryphal texts demonstrate the many different approaches to belief that existed in the first few centuries after his death. The Acts of Andrew's focus on asceticism, coupled with its desire for personal divine revelation, indicates a type of Christianity that may have been more mystical and spiritual than the institutionalized religion that eventually arose. One such big debate about the Acts of Andrew is whether the Acts of Andrew should be read as historical or symbolic. Some scholars argue that the book was written with the intent of inspiring believers, not as a record of actual events. Others claim that it might contain truths about Andrew's life and mission, but likely fabricated and exaggerated for the purpose of putting forward some theological concepts. The book's focus on abjuring worldly pleasures and welcoming suffering as a means to divine illumination is in accord with themes present in other early Christian writings, indicating that they were relatively mainstream at the time and only started being considered extreme by later church authorities. But, somewhat ironically, given one of their purported messages, this is not the end of the story for the Acts of Andrew. Their legacy continues to raise the interest of historians, theologians, and those curious about hidden Christianity. The emerging disciplines of biblical archaeology and manuscript studies have also inspired renewed efforts to find lost texts in the form of newly discovered scrolls, secret archives, or ancient libraries that remain unexplored. With every discovery, scholars are drawing closer to understanding how the broader history of Christian thought took shape, its many different voices. Nowadays, even outside academia, the notion of forbidden books has become alluring. This hooks into the itch we all have for suppressed knowledge and lost scriptures, and it has exploded into prominence with many people today doing everything possible to seek out the alternative biblical texts. Books, documentaries, and online discussions about apocryphal writings have introduced a new generation to the mysteries of early Christianity. The Acts could also be important, at least as far as certain movements or ways of thinking within Christianity are concerned, for the fact that this particular document helping to outline the development of the Christian faith has fallen off the rise in teachings everywhere. What the Acts of Andrew lacks in biblical literary merit, it makes up for in relevance for many Christians today. These lost messages, once beloved by early communities of faith, still offer powerful words of encouragement to those seeking to understand faith, wisdom, and truth today. There, at its core, the Acts of Andrew gives its own version of a Christianity replete with spirituality, personal transformation, and devotion to God, while at the same time rejecting materialistic concerns. The text was decried as heretical, but its themes, including a quest for a deeper relationship with God outside of formal religion, resonate among many. Acts of Andrew would note one of the strongest and wise teachings being asceticism. Andrew is portrayed in the book as a renouncer of worldliness, urging others to do likewise. The message of the song is a stark contrast to the aims of a modern world driven by consumption and possessions, taking its listeners a step back in the busy race towards materialistic riches and encouraging them to find both completeness in the tranquility of their hearts and in worshiping God. While practitioners of the former may not be the ideal for modern society, there remains a timeless lesson: the idea that material possessions should not be what rules your life. The Acts of Andrew, too, represents a vision of faith that is intensely personal and mystical. 730 views, 773 share 01926238081. Many of the greats of human history were people without formal spiritual training, often translators of divine revelations, as it is this that shows spiritual wisdom is behavior that comes from a divine source, but is not limited to those of religious institutions, mere religious education, to popoli, reli rose, but it is revealed too to those with an open heart. This concept colloquially subverts organized religious structures and resonates with contemporary proclivity towards individual spirituality. Many are disconnected from organized religion, but in the search for the divine, feeling that sense of connection is everything. This lost wisdom of Andrew's Acts shows that true faith does not result from following rules, but from contact with the divine. The Acts of Andrew isn't just about religion, however. It's also caught up in a broader conversation about lost books, and hidden wisdom. Throughout history, powerful institutions have determined which texts to save and which to throw away, thereby shaping the way people understood their own faith and their own heritage. The rejection of the Acts of Andrew mirrors a larger tendency towards suppressing alternative ideas to the orthodox narrative of human evolution via the Almighty. Today, as lost texts are rediscovered, there is a newfound interest in challenging the official story and approaching history from multiple viewpoints. There is no underestimating the cultural impact of forbidden books. Texts such as the Acts of Andrew remind us that religious history is not as clear-cut as it may seem. As with all religions, Christianity has evolved, with different tenets highlighted and some teachings intentionally discarded. This rediscovery of apocryphal texts has sparked new debates about the nature of early Christianity. Was it different and more pluralistic than we've learned? Were there different manifestations of Jesus' teachings that were subsequently squelched? The Acts of Andrew is one part of that many-sided story, suggesting a time in which disparate Christian communities were holding enormously diverse beliefs. For many, the allure of lost books is their buried wisdom. This idea that within the ancient texts there are secrets regarding spirituality, human nature, and the universe itself is a strong concept. The Acts of Andrew offers a different lens on Christianity, one rooted in individual renewal and a direct relationship with God, ideas that resonate with countless spiritual seekers even today. Regardless of believing it as historical fact or a symbolic tale, its lessons are timeless. Themes of perseverance, faith, and divine revelation speak to those who feel that truth is not passively accepted, but actively sought out. What does the suppression of the Acts of Andrew teach us about the past? Does history repeat itself? To this day, information is controlled, censored, and rewritten to fulfill specific purposes. Like the early church that strove to erase certain texts in order to have an organized doctrine, institutions, religious or political or academic, tend to want to shape narratives to retain the power. Books that have disappeared are a way to remember that knowledge is always being filtered, and it is up to the individual to seek out the full picture. And in this way, the Acts of Andrew still matters, not just as a text of antiquity, but as an emblem of the earliest stages of an ongoing battle between obscured truths and the record books. In the end, the Acts of Andrew is a powerful testament to the larger conversation the Acts of Andrew represents regarding faith, history, and the nature of canon, that is, what is left out, and how powerful that can be. Its teachings serve to inspire the questioner, the seeker exploring a world beyond yourself. And just as more lost texts keep rising to the surface, so too the story of Andrew and his divine teachings reminds us of how credible and how mortal the human search for spiritual truth can be, and how it will always return from the dead, no matter how many times history tries to kill it. And the exclusion of the Acts of Andrew is not just an interesting note on the history of a single work. It points to a larger narrative of control, curation, concealment, archival agency, and the story of knowledge itself. When texts like this have been eliminated from the mainstream, entire viewpoints get lost, and alongside them, deeper understandings of religion, spirituality, along with the annals of ancient Christianity. The Acts of Andrew, however, is much more than a story about a disciple. It is a proclamation of a different form of faith, one that emphasized personal abandonment, immediate contact with the divine, and avoidance of worldly power. Its suppressing begs important questions. Who decides what's in religious teachings? And what truths have we buried in the process? Religious and political authorities have sanctioned which texts are deemed sacred and which are classified as heretical. This process has alive not only Christianity, but the human consensus of spiritual truth at large. The Acts of Andrew was so rejected because it contained teachings that would not bear fruit in the soon-to-be Orthodox Church. Its emphasis on extreme ascetical practices, renunciation of material wealth, and mystical experiences ran counter to the emerging organized, institutionalized form of Christianity. But in wiping this text away was something of value lost as well. The impact of this suppression of such texts goes even further and is not limited to religion, as it also plays a role in how we see history in general. Through this narrative, the Acts of Andrew and other apocryphal writings have been removed, and a simplified narrative of events, one that can offer tangible symbols of communion with the divine, has emerged. But the presence of these lost tomes seems to indicate that early Christianity was much more diverse than anyone gives it credit for. Not all the followers of Jesus interpreted his teachings the same. Some adopted a profoundly mystical approach to faith, and others wanted to organize a unified doctrine. And we can see the struggle between these groups led to the suppression of texts viably too radical, too challenging, too different from the emerging orthodoxy. In recent years, the rediscovery of lost texts has become a challenge to official histories. These heretical texts speak to scholarly, theological, and spiritual seekers, for they provide a fuller and perhaps even more complex account of religious tradition. In this respect, the Acts of Andrew has much to tell us about an early kind of Christianity that was perhaps more interested in personal redemption and relationship with God than in institutional power. Though not new, its teachings continue to resonate with those who have been turned off from mainstream religion but are seeking a deeper spiritual experience. But the Acts of Andrew isn't only religious. It's a warning. When all knowledge is erased, humanity loses not just its data, but also its reasoning, its ability to question, to find and ask different questions. Deterring ideas is not merely a relic of history, it remains a current phenomenon. Politics, science, and religion, in all forms of acceptance and denial, in all forms of argument and truth, it is often those in power who decide what constitutes truth and what will be dismissed as falsehood. The history of forbidden books reminds us that learning is something to be sought out in the world, and not just something we take for granted. So what does the Acts of Andrew teach us? First, that history is never as straightforward as it appears. Those who wrote the stories have told us the stories, have been those who had control of the narrative. Second, that lost wisdom is still out there, if we have the will to look for it. And finally, that the search for truth never ends. The book's history lost serve as a reminder that there's always something to find, something to ask, something to learn. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Bible Says Now to explore more lost history, hidden texts, and biblical mysteries. And if you'd like to support this type of research, please send a super thanks. Any donation goes a long way to helping us continue to publish and spotlight these stories. Tell us in the comments, what are your thoughts on the Acts of Andrew? Why should lost texts inform modern conversations of faith? Or were they honestly obliterated? We love hearing your perspectives and opinions.